The air in the jungle was thick and heavy, filled with the sound of insects and distant bird calls. The heat wrapped around everything like a warm, wet blanket. Deep inside this untouched part of the rainforest, a small team of explorers slowly made their way through the dense green wall of trees and vines. At the front of the group walked Liam, a quiet man with sharp eyes and a calm, steady way of moving. He had spent years exploring wild places, but something about this trip already felt different. They had started their journey early that morning, long before the sun rose fully over the treetops. The path was barely a path at all, just a faint trail where the plants grew a little thinner. Liam carried a worn map, though it didn't show much. Most of this area had never been properly charted. The group was here to document wildlife and record untouched sections of the forest. But as they moved deeper in, Liam couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was waiting for them. The jungle around them was alive. Branches creaked in the breeze. Small creatures rustled in the undergrowth. Brightly colored birds swooped between the trees, and the ground was soft with thick layers of fallen leaves. Every few minutes, the group had to stop to cut away vines blocking their way. Sweat ran down their faces and their clothes were soaked. It was the kind of place where time slowed down. Every step felt heavier. Then something caught Liam's eye. It was just a flicker of light at first, like sunlight bouncing off metal. He stopped walking and squinted through the thick green wall ahead. The others nearly bumped into him. "Wait," he whispered softly. The group went quiet. All they could hear was the buzzing of insects and the steady hum of the forest. Liam took a few steps forward, brushing leaves out of the way. For a moment, the light disappeared. Then it flashed again, clearer this time. It was a reflection. But that didn't make sense. "There shouldn't have been anything metal out here. Do you see that?" One of the others whispered behind him. Liam didn't answer. He just nodded slowly. His heart was beating a little faster now. The team pushed forward carefully. The forest got thicker for a few meters, then suddenly opened up into a wide, unexpected clearing. It was as if someone had carved a giant hole in the middle of the jungle. The ground was uneven, covered in long grass, and at the center of it stood something that made everyone stop in their tracks. There, towering over the trees, was a massive ship, not a small boat. Not a piece of broken wreckage. It was a full-size cruise ship, tilted slightly to one side, its metal body wrapped in vines and moss. The sunlight hit its faded white paint, and the rust on the sides glimmered in the light. The jungle had grown all around it like it had been sitting there for decades, forgotten. For a few seconds, nobody said a word. It didn't even feel real. "How is that possible?" Someone whispered softly. Liam slowly stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry grass. His eyes scanned the enormous structure in front of him. It looked like something pulled straight out of another world. Huge decks stretched upward, balconies hung at odd angles, and shattered windows reflected the green of the forest. Tall trees stood only a few meters away from the ship's hull, their roots twisting over rusted railings. The ship was silent. There were no birds perched on it, no animals moving around. It felt like the jungle itself was holding its breath. Liam turned back to the group. "This wasn't on any map," he said quietly. "Of course it wasn't," someone replied nervously. "How could a cruise ship end up here? There's no ocean for hundreds of miles." He didn't have an answer. None of them did. The team carefully circled the edge of the clearing, looking at the size of the vessel. It was huge, easily the length of a football field. The metal was old and covered in rust, but the shape of the ship was clear. The name was faintly visible on the side, the letters peeling away but still just readable enough to make out. It was the name of a ship that had once sailed with hundreds of people aboard. Liam recognized it. He had seen that name in old reports years ago. This wasn't just any ship. It was the same cruise liner that had vanished in the middle of the ocean decades earlier, during a violent storm. It had been the subject of countless news stories, endless speculation, and wild theories. Many people believed it had sunk. Some thought it had been hijacked. Others believed it had simply disappeared, leaving nothing behind but questions. And yet here it was, standing in the heart of the jungle like a giant ghost. Liam felt a shiver crawl up his arms despite the heat. They approached slowly, their boots sinking into soft earth. Up close, the ship looked even stranger. The hull had been eaten away in places, vines hanging down like ropes, but the main body was intact. A few broken lifeboats were half buried in the dirt, covered in moss. One of the explorers reached out and touched the side of the ship. The metal was hot from the sun but solid. Real. "It's not a dream," Liam said under his breath. They found what looked like an emergency ladder still attached to the lower deck. It was rusted but steady enough to hold their weight. They didn't climb it yet. Instead, they walked along the base of the ship trying to find some clue as to how it got there. But there were no tire tracks, no marks of heavy equipment, no sign of it being dragged. It was just sitting there, like it had always been part of the forest. Liam crouched down and brushed away some leaves near the hull. Underneath, the soil was packed hard, as if the weight of the ship had pressed it down over time. This wasn't something that had arrived recently. This ship had been here for years, maybe even decades. As the team explored further around the clearing, they noticed other strange details. The grass near the ship was different from the rest of the jungle floor, slightly lighter in color and shorter, as if it didn't grow the same way here. A few meters away, they found an old metal container half buried in dirt. It had the ship's name on it. Someone or something had once tried to move things out of the ship, but not much. Liam took out his small notebook and began writing down every detail. He had spent much of his life studying old ruins and forgotten places, but he had never seen anything remotely like this. A ship in the middle of the rainforest wasn't just strange. It was impossible. They paused to drink some water, sitting quietly on fallen logs near the edge of the clearing. Nobody could stop looking at the ship. It felt like it was staring back at them, daring them to come closer. "What do you think happened?" one of them finally asked. Liam shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." The sun moved higher in the sky, and the shadows of the trees stretched across the ship's surface. Birds began to return to the area, chirping from the branches above. It broke the silence a little, but the eerie feeling didn't go away. The ship still loomed over them, still out of place. Liam walked a bit closer to the ladder. His hands brushed against the rough metal, and he looked up at the dark openings of the upper decks. From down here, it looked like a giant hollow face. Windows were smashed, doors hung off their hinges, and vines spilled out like veins. If this ship had a story to tell, it was trapped inside those walls. He turned back to the group. "We'll go inside tomorrow," he said. "We need to set up camp first." They nodded in agreement. The jungle was unpredictable, and they needed to be prepared. They set up their tents a safe distance from the ship, near the edge of the clearing. As night slowly began to fall, the sound of the forest grew louder. Crickets chirped. Frogs croaked from somewhere nearby. But through it all, the ship stood completely still, a silent giant in the moonlight. Liam sat outside his tent staring at it. The metal caught the fading light, glowing faintly against the darkening trees. He couldn't stop thinking about the moment they first saw it. That flash of sunlight through the leaves, that sense of something waiting. How could a ship sail through land? How could something built to float on water end up in a place like this? His mind raced through possibilities: floods, landslides, human intervention. None of it made sense. The distance from the nearest river was too far. The terrain was too rough. There was no logical explanation. The ship had vanished decades ago with everyone on board. But if it had ended up here, what had happened to the people? The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees. Somewhere inside the ship, a loose piece of metal creaked softly. It sounded almost like a whisper. Liam glanced up quickly, but the ship was still dark and motionless. He took a deep breath and forced himself to relax. Tomorrow they would step inside. Tomorrow they might finally get some answers. But for now, he just sat and watched, knowing this was only the beginning of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The jungle felt different that night. Not dangerous, but watchful. The ship was no ordinary wreck. It was a mystery that had been waiting for years to be found. And now that it was, nothing would ever be the same again. The sun rose slowly over the treetops, turning the jungle a soft golden green. Mist hung low over the clearing, and the air felt cooler than it had the day before. Birds were already singing, their calls echoing through the trees. Liam stood outside his tent, staring at the giant cruise ship sitting silently at the center of the clearing. Even in the early light, it looked unreal. A ship like that belonged in the ocean, not trapped in the middle of a dense forest. The others began to wake up, stretching their arms, rubbing their eyes, and boiling water for coffee. There wasn't much talking at first. Everyone was still trying to make sense of what they had seen. Nobody could stop looking at the ship. It was too big, too strange, too impossible. Liam walked a few steps closer to it. The hull was covered in vines and moss, but now that the sun was up, he could see the details more clearly. The name of the ship was printed on the side in faded letters. He ran his fingers lightly over the rough surface. The letters peeled away at his touch. He recognized the name from a news article he had once read. This was a ship that had disappeared during a powerful storm at sea. No wreckage had ever been found. It was as if it had vanished from the face of the earth. And yet here it was. One of the team members walked over and stood beside him. "It's bigger than I thought," they said softly. "It almost feels alive," Liam nodded. "Yeah, it does." They both stood there for a moment, listening to the sounds of the jungle. Then Liam stepped back and took a deep breath. "We go in today," he said. "Carefully." After breakfast, they packed their gear. Flashlights, cameras, ropes, gloves, masks, everything they might need. The ship had been here for years. It could be unstable inside. They moved slowly toward the rusty ladder they had found the day before. Liam tested it first. It creaked under his weight but didn't break. With careful steps, he climbed up onto the lower deck. The metal felt warm under his boots. Up close, the ship was even more intimidating. The others followed one by one. They stood together on the deck, surrounded by silence. A warm breeze brushed across their faces. The deck was covered in fallen leaves, vines, and pieces of broken glass. Old deck chairs were scattered around, eaten away by time. A sign with the ship's name hung crookedly above a door, swinging slightly. Liam pushed open the first door. It groaned loudly, echoing down the dark hallway beyond. The smell hit them immediately, a mix of rust, damp wood, and something old like forgotten air trapped for years. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness. The hallway was narrow, lined with peeling wallpaper and cracked mirrors. Dust floated in the air. Old carpets covered the floor, soft and rotten under their feet. It was quiet except for the faint sound of dripping water somewhere deep inside the ship. Liam's heart was pounding. Not out of fear exactly, but out of that strange feeling when you step into a place frozen in time. The others followed close behind, their lights bouncing off the walls. They walked deeper inside. On one side of the hallway were doors that had once led to passenger cabins. Most were slightly open, as if people had left in a hurry. Inside, they found old suitcases, broken furniture, faded photographs, and clothes turned to dust. A half-empty cup still sat on one of the tables. It felt as if the passengers had simply vanished. "Look at this," someone whispered, picking up a cracked photo frame from the floor. It showed a smiling family standing on the deck of the ship, the ocean behind them. It was strange to see something so happy inside a place that felt so abandoned. Liam carefully took the photo and slipped it into a plastic bag. Everything here told a story. It was their job to find out what had happened. They moved on, stepping over fallen beams and broken glass. The ship was massive, and the deeper they went, the stranger it felt. There were no signs of animals, no signs of life at all. It was like the ship had been waiting in silence. When they reached the grand lobby, everyone stopped. The room opened up into a wide, circular space with a curved staircase in the center. Long vines wrapped around the railing like hands holding on. The walls were decorated with faded gold trim, and a huge chandelier hung from the ceiling, tilted to one side. It looked like a scene from a movie, except it was real and covered in dust and decay. Liam's flashlight passed over the reception desk. There were old papers scattered across it. Some were still readable: passenger lists, maps, daily schedules from the last days before the ship disappeared. He flipped through a few pages, his eyes catching on a date. It matched the night the ship vanished. Everything had been left untouched. They heard a soft sound then, a creak somewhere above them. Everyone froze. Liam tilted his head, listening. The ship groaned faintly, the way old metal does when it settles. It was just the wind moving through broken windows. Still, it made their hearts race a little faster. They climbed the staircase slowly. On the upper floors, the cabins looked more expensive, large rooms with wide beds, big windows, and heavy furniture. It had once been a place of luxury. Now it was just silent and empty. A few doors were locked, but most had already been forced open by time. In one room, Liam found a captain's hat lying on the floor. In another, a broken radio. Dust covered everything like a blanket. And then, near the end of a hallway, he noticed something unusual. Carved into the wall were strange symbols. They weren't part of the ship's original design. Someone had scratched them into the wood. They were uneven but deliberate, like someone had done it with a knife. Liam ran his fingers gently over the markings. He didn't recognize them. They didn't look like any language he knew. One of the others shone their flashlight on the carvings. "What do you think that is?" they asked. "I don't know," Liam said quietly. But it wasn't done when the ship was new. Someone was here after. The realization settled over the group like a weight. They weren't the first to find this ship. Someone had been here long before them. They followed the hallway further until they reached the captain's quarters. The door was closed, but it wasn't locked. Liam slowly turned the handle and pushed it open. The room was larger than the others. A big wooden desk stood by the window, covered in scattered papers. A cracked clock hung crookedly on the wall. A map of the world was still pinned behind the desk, edges yellowed with time. Liam picked up the logbook lying open on the desk. The handwriting inside was neat and careful at first, recording weather conditions, routes, and passenger details. But the last few entries were rushed, messy. The words were smudged, but he could make out fragments. Storm growing stronger. Lost communication. Light in the distance. Unusual pull. Not natural. Can't explain. Passengers panicking. The last line was barely readable. It simply said, "We're not alone." Liam felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He passed the logbook to one of the others. No one spoke for a long time. They all felt it, that cold, unsettling feeling that something terrible had happened here. They spent hours exploring the ship, documenting everything. They found luggage still in storage rooms, dining halls with tables set as if dinner had been interrupted, and life jackets stacked neatly in corners. Everything suggested the passengers had left in a hurry, but there was no sign of where they went. When they reached the lower levels, the air grew cooler and damp. Their flashlights flickered against long corridors lined with metal doors. Some rooms were flooded with murky water, others were filled with crates marked with shipping codes. But one door was different. It was thicker, made of reinforced metal and had no handle on the outside. It didn't match the rest of the ship's design. Someone had built it later. They stood in front of it for a long moment. "Why would a cruise ship have a door like this?" someone asked softly. Liam didn't answer. He just stared at it, feeling that same strange pull he had felt yesterday when he first saw the ship through the trees. This door was hiding something. They couldn't open it yet. They didn't have the tools. So they marked the spot on their map and decided to return later with the right equipment. As they climbed back up to the deck, the sun was beginning to sink behind the trees. Orange light spilled over the hull of the ship, making the vines glow. It was beautiful and unsettling all at once. The team sat quietly near the railing, catching their breath and letting the day sink in. Liam took out the captain's logbook again and read through the last pages. Each line told a story of growing fear and confusion. The captain had no idea where the ship was being pulled. He wrote about strange lights on the horizon, about compasses spinning wildly, about the sea turning still as glass before everything went black. And then, nothing. No final entry. No explanation. Just silence. Liam looked up at the jungle surrounding them. The ship had ended up here, far away from the ocean. The question was how. And maybe more importantly, why? The team returned to their camp just as darkness began to cover the clearing. The jungle came alive with night sounds. Frogs, insects, rustling leaves. The ship loomed above them like a giant shadow. They sat around a small fire, not talking much. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't just the mystery of how the ship got here anymore. It was everything they had seen inside. The untouched cabins, the strange carvings, the locked door that didn't belong. Liam stared at the ship's outline in the dark. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was holding on to something important, something no one had ever meant to find. Tomorrow they would go back. The jungle was still dark when Liam woke up. A thin layer of mist floated just above the ground, and the early morning air felt cool against his skin. The first thing he saw when he stepped outside his tent was the massive shape of the ship in the clearing. Even in the soft gray light before sunrise, it looked almost unreal, like something that had drifted in from another world. The camp was quiet. Only the faint sound of insects and distant birds filled the silence. Liam sat down on a fallen log and stared at the ship for a long time. His mind kept going back to the strange metal door they had found deep in the lower levels. It didn't belong there. Cruise ships were built for comfort and travel, not hidden sealed rooms. That door was a secret, and secrets were rarely simple. One by one, the others woke up, stretching their arms and talking quietly. No one needed to be reminded of what they had planned today. Everyone already knew. Today they were going to open the door. They ate a quick breakfast, then checked their equipment. Rope, tools, flashlights, masks, crowbars, everything they thought they might need. No one joked around. The feeling in the air was heavier than before. Yesterday the ship had felt strange. Today it felt like it was waiting. The group climbed up the rusted ladder and stepped onto the deck again. The metal groaned softly under their boots. Sunlight was just beginning to spill through the treetops, painting the ship's surface with a warm orange glow. Vines hung from the railings, swaying gently in the wind. The ship was as silent as ever. They entered through the same door as before, walking down the long, narrow hallway that smelled of rust and damp wood. Dust floated in the beams of their flashlights. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floor soft beneath their feet. It was strange how quickly the forest sounds disappeared as soon as they stepped inside. It was like crossing into another world, a world frozen in time. They passed through the grand lobby again, climbing over broken furniture and stepping around puddles of water. Liam led the way, moving carefully. Every sound they made seemed louder than it should have been. When they reached the lower decks, the air grew cooler and heavier. The smell of damp metal filled their noses. Their flashlights flickered off the wet walls. They passed the storage rooms, the flooded corridors, and finally stood once more in front of the thick metal door. It was exactly how they had left it. The surface was smooth and cold to the touch, unlike the rest of the ship's rusted walls. No markings, no handle, just a flat gray door that didn't fit in with anything else around it. Liam placed his hand against it. It was colder than the air. That alone sent a chill down his spine. "We open it slowly," he said quietly. The others nodded. They positioned the crowbars and tools along the edges, searching for weak points. The metal resisted at first, creaking softly. But after several long minutes, the door finally shifted. A low metallic groan echoed down the corridor, and then it slowly swung open, releasing a rush of stale air from the darkness inside. They shone their flashlights in. The room beyond was large and hidden, with walls made of smooth steel. Unlike the rest of the ship, it was clean and almost untouched by time. There was no moss, no vines, no signs of decay. In the middle of the room stood a row of tall metal crates, each one sealed shut. Against one wall were tables covered in old equipment, strange machines with blinking lights that were long dead. Liam stepped in first, the sound of his boots echoing softly. The air inside was cold and dry. It felt different from the rest of the ship, like it had been sealed away for a reason. The others followed slowly, shining their lights around. "What is this place?" someone whispered. Liam didn't answer right away. He walked closer to one of the crates. The metal was covered in faint symbols he didn't recognize. He ran his fingers over them. They were carved deep, not just painted on. Using a crowbar, they pried open the first crate. Inside were long, narrow cases wrapped in thick fabric. Liam carefully unwrapped one. What lay inside wasn't something they expected. It looked like a piece of machinery, but not like anything they'd ever seen before. It was smooth, without screws or seams, almost like it had been formed out of a single piece of metal. He turned it in his hands. It was surprisingly light. Whatever it was, it didn't belong on a regular cruise ship. They opened more crates. Some contained strange glass containers filled with crystal-like stones that glimmered faintly in the light. Others held metal boxes with switches and panels, their purpose unclear. The more they opened, the clearer it became. This was not a storage room for passenger luggage. This was something else entirely. One of the explorers found a folder lying on a table. It was thick with papers and covered in dust. Liam opened it carefully. The documents inside were old but still readable. Many pages were filled with technical language and diagrams. Some were stamped with official-looking seals. He couldn't understand everything, but one thing stood out. These were not public documents. Liam flipped through the folder until he reached a page with a date. It matched the exact week the ship had disappeared. There were references to an experimental transport mission, though the details were vague. At the bottom of the page was a red stamp that read, "Restricted." This ship wasn't just carrying passengers, Liam said softly. It was carrying something else. They searched the room for hours. They found old journals, strange objects, and pieces of equipment that looked far too advanced for the time the ship had sailed. Every discovery only deepened the mystery. On the far wall, they noticed a door, smaller and partially hidden behind some crates. It wasn't locked, but it was stuck. After some effort, they forced it open. Beyond it was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Liam hesitated. The air coming from below was colder than the rest of the ship. But they had come too far to stop now. "Let's go," he said quietly. The staircase creaked as they descended. Their flashlights lit the walls, revealing more strange markings carved into the metal. They didn't look random. They looked deliberate, almost like a warning. At the bottom, they found a small room. It was circular, with a single large object in the center covered by a heavy tarp. Liam slowly reached out and pulled the tarp away. Beneath it was something none of them could name. It looked like a machine, but also like something alive. Smooth metal curved in strange shapes, glowing faintly even after all these years. No wires, no buttons, no rust. It felt completely out of place, not just on the ship, but in the world they knew. They stared at it in silence, their breaths echoing softly in the room. "What is that?" someone whispered, their voice shaking a little. Liam didn't have an answer. He stepped closer and placed his hand gently on the surface. It was warm. Not hot, just warm, like something that had been asleep for a very long time. Suddenly, a low hum filled the room. Everyone jumped back. The glow coming from the machine grew a little brighter. Liam's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't pressed anything. He hadn't done anything, but the machine was responding to them. The sound lasted only a few seconds, then faded away. The glow dimmed again, but the silence that followed felt even heavier than before. Liam turned to the others. "This isn't just some forgotten cargo," he said. "This was hidden here for a reason. And whatever it is, it's not dead." They left the lower room quietly, carrying the documents they had found. The sun was already high by the time they stepped back onto the deck. The jungle outside felt almost peaceful compared to the cold, silent rooms below. They sat near the railing, catching their breath. No one spoke for a long time. Everyone was processing what they had seen. It was no longer just a story about a lost ship. This was something far bigger, something that someone somewhere had tried very hard to keep hidden. Liam looked out at the tree line. The ship had been lying here for decades, waiting. But waiting for what? That night, the camp was quiet. The usual talk and laughter were gone. The machine's faint hum seemed to echo in Liam's head. He sat by the small campfire, staring at the ship through the darkness. The captain's log had talked about a storm and strange lights. The door they had found didn't belong to a passenger vessel. And now, they had uncovered something deep inside that didn't seem to belong to their world at all. Liam couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't just discovered the ship. They had awakened it. As the night deepened, a soft wind moved through the clearing. Somewhere inside the ship, a metallic creak echoed faintly, like the sound of a giant taking a slow breath. Liam didn't sleep much that night. None of them did. The jungle felt different now. The ship wasn't just an abandoned vessel anymore. It had secrets buried deep inside, and those secrets had just started to stir. As the explorer and his small team moved deeper into the lower decks of the abandoned ship, the air became heavier. The dim light from their flashlights bounced off the wet, rusted walls, creating strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. The jungle's noise had faded behind them. Now all they could hear was the steady sound of dripping water and the soft creak of metal. Every step echoed like a whisper in the dark. And even though they were all experienced explorers, something about this place made their skin crawl. They had already passed through cabins that looked frozen in time. Old suitcases were still stacked in corners, shoes were placed neatly beside rotting beds, and faded photographs clung to cracked walls. It was as if people had simply walked out one day and never came back. But here, below deck, it felt different. It felt like this part of the ship was never meant for passengers. One of the team members noticed something odd along the corridor. A large section of the wall looked newer than the rest. While everything else was covered in rust and mold, this panel looked almost untouched. It was thick and smooth, and when they knocked on it, it made a dull metallic sound. It wasn't just a wall. It was a door. The group exchanged uneasy glances. This door was out of place. It didn't fit the style of the rest of the cruise ship. Unlike the other doors, this one had no handle or lock. Just a thick metal plate that stretched from floor to ceiling. The explorer ran his hand over the cold surface and felt a small groove along the side. It wasn't visible at first glance, but it was there. Something was hidden behind this. They decided to set up a few portable lights to brighten the area. As the beams filled the corridor, more details became clear. Faint markings lined the edges of the metal, almost like symbols. They weren't letters or numbers, just strange shapes scratched into the steel, as if someone had tried to leave a warning. One of the team members let out a nervous laugh, trying to ease the tension, but no one responded. The silence in that hallway was thick. After several minutes of examining the structure, they found a small rectangular panel to the right of the door. Inside it was a set of switches and wires, all corroded by time. Whatever had powered it was long dead, but the explorer knew there might still be a way to open it manually. He carefully pried open the panel, exposing more of the mechanism. With steady hands, they worked together, using a crowbar and some rope to create leverage. The metal groaned loudly as they forced it, and dust rained down from the ceiling. Then, with a deep echoing sound, the door shifted. A line of light appeared between the seams, and a cold draft rushed out, carrying a strange smell. It wasn't just the musty odor of rust. It was something chemical, something they couldn't quite place. The door slowly slid open, revealing a massive chamber behind it. The space was unlike anything they had seen in the ship so far. It wasn't a passenger area at all. It looked like a laboratory or maybe a storage facility. Rows of large metal crates were stacked along the walls, covered with thick layers of dust and vines that had crept in over the years. In the center stood heavy equipment, built from materials that looked too advanced for the time the ship had vanished. Their flashlights swept across the room, catching sight of strange objects on tables. Some were wrapped in glass containers, others sealed in faded boxes. The explorer approached the nearest crate and wiped off the dust. Stamped on the side were faint numbers and letters, along with a symbol he didn't recognize. The metal looked thicker than normal shipping containers, almost like it was designed to protect whatever was inside. Curiosity pushed them further in. One of the team members used a small tool to break open the rusty lock on one of the crates. When they lifted the lid, their breath caught. Inside were dozens of smooth, crystal-like objects. They weren't ordinary stones. These crystals gave off a faint light, a soft bluish glow that filled the room with an eerie beauty. It was like holding a piece of the night sky. The group was silent for a moment, unsure what they were looking at. These weren't artifacts anyone had ever seen before. They weren't labeled either, just stacked carefully as if they were valuable or dangerous. The explorer gently touched one of them, and for a split second it felt warm, like it had a pulse. They moved to the next crate, finding more strange items. Long metal rods with no visible seams, as if they had been formed in one single piece. Small devices with buttons that didn't match any known design. Old paper files sat nearby, their pages yellowed but still intact. The handwriting was faded, but one word appeared over and over again. Restricted. In the far corner of the chamber, they discovered something even stranger. A machine unlike anything they had ever seen. It was large, with curved edges and panels covered in switches and gauges. Vines had wrapped around it over the years. But the structure itself was still in surprisingly good condition. It was clear this wasn't a part of any luxury cruise liner. This was something else entirely. The explorer walked slowly around the machine, running his hand along its cold surface. There were no brand markings, no country of origin, no manufacturing details. Just smooth metal and those same strange symbols carved faintly near the base. The design didn't match anything from the era when the ship disappeared. It almost felt like it didn't belong to any era at all. Suddenly, one of the team members called him over. Against the far wall, half buried under debris, they had found a set of metal lockers. Inside, wrapped in plastic sheets, were what looked like protective suits. Heavy silver-colored suits with thick glass visors. They were in surprisingly good condition, as if they had been meant for something serious. No ordinary cruise ship carried gear like this. The explorer began to piece it together. This ship hadn't just been a floating hotel. Something secret was hidden here. Something big. Maybe this was why it had vanished. Maybe the storm that supposedly took it wasn't the whole truth. They carefully continued to document everything. Every crate, every symbol, every piece of equipment. The deeper they explored, the more questions they found. Why would a passenger ship carry classified-looking equipment? Who put it there? And how had the ship ended up so far from the ocean? As they searched the chamber, they found a set of old journals inside a metal cabinet. The pages were damp but readable. The handwriting was neat and formal, like someone used to keeping records. The entries spoke of transport missions, strict secrecy, and unusual readings from the cargo. One line stood out the most. If we reach the designated point, everything changes. The explorer read those words again and again. The designated point could have been anywhere, but the fact that the ship was in the middle of a jungle meant something had gone very wrong. As the night grew deeper, they decided to camp inside the ship. It was safer than outside in the wild. The chamber felt unsettling, but also strangely quiet. The sound of the jungle barely reached down here. It was like they were cut off from the world above. While the others rested, the explorer sat alone by one of the crates, staring at the glowing crystals. There was something about them that drew him in. He felt a mixture of wonder and unease. These objects were not meant to be here. This ship was hiding a story that no one had ever told. A faint breeze passed through the corridor, carrying a low hum from somewhere deeper in the ship. It wasn't the wind. It sounded mechanical, like something far inside the vessel had just come to life for the first time in decades. The explorer stood up slowly, the hair on his arms standing on end. He didn't know if it was his imagination or if something inside this ship wasn't as lifeless as it seemed. He didn't tell the others yet. There would be time for that in the morning. But deep down, he knew what they had found wasn't just a forgotten ship. It was a secret buried in plain sight, and they had only just opened the door to it. The crystals glowed softly through the night, their faint light reflecting on the metal walls like tiny stars. Outside, the jungle slept, but inside the ship something was waiting.